Imagine waking up before dawn on a rotting straw mattress, your body aching from yesterday's 15 hours of back-breaking labor. The one-room hovel you share with your 8 family members, and various livestock reeks of human waste and animal dung. You have no choice but to drag your exhausted body up, because if you don't work today, your feudal lord will have you flogged. And that persistent cough that's been plaguing you for months, that's probably the beginning of the tuberculosis that will kill you before you reach 40. Welcome to the nightmarish existence of a medieval peasant, where daily life wasn't just difficult. It was a brutal gauntlet of suffering that modern people can scarcely comprehend. You've probably imagined medieval peasant life as a simpler, more authentic existence, hard-working folks in rustic cottages, tending picturesque fields under the benevolent watch of a local lord. Perhaps you've even romanticized this seemingly uncomplicated life during particularly frustrating moments, dealing with your boss or scrolling through social media. It's time to shatter those quaint fantasies with the sledgehammer of historical reality. The life of a medieval peasant wasn't just challenging by modern standards. It was a horrific daily struggle for survival that would break even the strongest among us within days. The truth about medieval peasant existence is so brutal that your history textbooks sanitized it beyond recognition. What we're about to explore isn't just an inconvenient historical footnote. It's a shocking testament to human endurance that will make you grateful for even the worst day of your modern life. Let's dive into the grim reality of being at the absolute bottom of medieval society, where your entire existence was defined by servitude, suffering, and an early grave. Your day as a medieval peasant would begin in darkness, usually around 4 a.m. in summer months. Forget alarm clocks. Your body was conditioned by years of the same punishing schedule, and the roosters served as nature's unwelcome wake-up call. The bed you'd rise from barely deserved the name. A rough sack stuffed with straw or leaves, likely infested with fleas, lice, bedbugs, and mice. On cold nights, you'd sleep in your clothes, possibly with family members pressed against you for warmth, and maybe even with your animals brought inside to both preserve their lives and benefit from their body heat. The one-room house you called home would shock modern health inspectors into cardiac arrest. Constructed of wattle and daub, essentially sticks woven together and covered with a mixture of mud, clay, dung, and straw, your walls were permeable to insects, rodents, and weather. The roof, thatched with reeds or straw, leaked during heavy rains and provided the perfect habitat for all manner of vermin that would occasionally fall onto sleeping family members. The floor was simply packed earth, which turned to mud during wet seasons. There were no windows, just small openings that might be covered with oiled parchment or thin animal hide if you were among the more prosperous peasants. Most homes had a central hearth with no chimney, meaning your dwelling was constantly filled with smoke that stung your eyes and damaged your lungs, but served the practical purpose of somewhat preserving your meager food stores and keeping the worst of the insects at bay. Your home had no bathroom, no toilet, no sink. Human waste was typically collected in a bucket or pot and emptied outside. Though in bad weather, the corner of the room might suffice. Your entire family, parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes extended relatives, lived, slept, ate, and relieved themselves in this single room of perhaps 400 square feet. Privacy was a concept that simply didn't exist. The truly shocking aspect of peasant housing wasn't just its primitive nature, but how little it changed throughout the medieval period. While nobles gradually upgraded from drafty castles to more comfortable manor houses, peasant dwellings remained virtually the same from the early Middle Ages through the Renaissance. Technological advancements that improved the lives of the wealthy rarely trickled down to those who worked the land. Now let's talk about what you'd eat, or more accurately, what you'd attempt to survive on. Forget the hearty medieval feasts depicted in movies. Those were for nobles and wealthy merchants. Your diet as a peasant was mind-numbingly monotonous and nutritionally inadequate by any modern standard. The foundation of your diet would be bread, dark, coarse bread made from rye or barley, not the refined wheat reserved for your betters. During good harvests, you might consume up to 2 pounds of this bread daily. It wasn't just dense and often poorly baked. It frequently contained ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and causes hallucinations, burning sensations in the limbs, and eventually gangrene. Yes, your daily bread could literally cause your limbs to rot and fall off. Your protein would come primarily from legumes like peas and beans, supplemented occasionally with salted herring or other preserved fish. Fresh meat was a rare luxury, perhaps enjoyed a few times a year on major feast days. Even then, you'd likely receive the undesirable parts, organs, feet, heads, after the Lord had taken his choice cuts. Dairy existed in your diet, though the milk was quickly turned to cheese, or butter to preserve it. Fresh vegetables were seasonal and limited to what you could grow: onions, garlic, cabbage, turnips, and perhaps a few herbs. Fruit might be available in late summer and autumn, but would quickly disappear with the harvest. The most disturbing aspect of the peasant diet wasn't just its monotony, but its insufficiency. Most peasants lived in a state of chronic malnutrition. During the winter months, and especially in the hungry gap of late spring, when stored foods ran out but new crops weren't yet ready, actual starvation was common. Historical records show that peasant height decreased during the Middle Ages, a clear sign of generational malnutrition. Your cooking methods were as primitive as your ingredients. Everything was boiled in a single pot hung over the fire, creating an ever-evolving stew that might simmer for days as new ingredients were added to replace what was eaten. Bread was baked communally in village ovens, as individual homes couldn't support proper baking facilities. Even salt, essential for preserving food, was heavily taxed and therefore used sparingly. Water wasn't considered a drink for adults, except in dire necessity. Instead, you'd consume ale or beer, brewed weekly with about 2–3% alcohol. This wasn't for intoxication, but survival. The brewing process killed many of the pathogens in the often contaminated water sources. Children drank whey, a byproduct of cheese-making or watered-down ale. During famine years, which occurred with terrifying regularity due to crop failures, weather events, or plague, peasants resorted to famine foods that would horrify modern diners. Tree bark ground into flour, nettles and other weeds boiled into soup. Clay mixed with what little flour was available to create more substantial bread. In the most desperate times, historical accounts describe peasants exhuming recently buried corpses or consuming leather from shoes and belts after boiling them to make them minimally chewable. Let's move on to your daily work, the backbreaking labor that defined peasant existence. Modern people complain about their 40-hour work weeks in climate-controlled offices. Medieval peasants would find our concept of hard work laughable if they weren't too exhausted to laugh. As a peasant, you worked from sunrise to sunset, which meant up to 16-hour days in summer months. The labor wasn't just long, it was physically punishing in ways modern people can scarcely comprehend. Plowing meant walking behind an ox or horse for miles each day, struggling to keep the heavy wooden plow in the ground, while navigating rocks and roots that could snap your wrist if the plow struck them suddenly. Harvesting was done entirely by hand with scythes and sickles, requiring you to bend at the waist for hours, straightening only to relieve the screaming pain in your back before bending again. Threshing, separating grain from stalks, involved beating the harvested crops with flails, generating clouds of dust and chaff that you'd inhale continuously, damaging your lungs over years of harvest seasons. Every task was manual, from hauling water from distant wells to chopping and carrying firewood. Women's work was no less strenuous, involving grinding grain by hand, scrubbing clothes against rocks in often freezing streams, and maintaining the household while also helping with field work during crucial seasons. The truly shocking aspect was that all this labor wasn't building anything for yourself. As a serf, the most common type of peasant, you worked primarily for your lord's benefit. Depending on the region and era, you owed 3 to 5 days of labor per week on the lord's lands before you could even touch your own modest plots. You also owed a significant portion of your harvest as rent, typically 30% or more of everything you grew. Additionally, you paid taxes to both your lord and the church. The church claimed a tithe, 10% of everything you produced. Your lord claimed taxes for using his mill to grind your grain, his ovens to bake your bread, and his presses to make your oil or wine. He collected head taxes for simply existing, hearth taxes for having a fire, and special taxes whenever he needed to raise funds for war or his daughter's wedding. After all these extractions, medieval records suggest most peasant families were left with just enough to subsist, and in bad years not even that. This wasn't just economic hardship, it was institutionalized exploitation backed by violence. If you failed to pay or tried to hide part of your harvest, the punishments ranged from public flogging to imprisonment. The medieval work calendar offered little respite, while religious feast days provided some breaks, perhaps 50 days spread. Throughout the year, many of these still involved community labor like maintaining roads or parish buildings. Sunday was theoretically a day of rest, though animals still needed tending, and emergencies like dangerous weather couldn't be ignored. VC. Medieval peasants' relationship with authority was perhaps the most soul-crushing aspect of their existence. You weren't just poor and overworked, you were essentially owned. Serfs were legally bound to the land they worked. You couldn't leave your village without permission. You couldn't marry without your lord's approval, which typically required her fee. You couldn't even learn to read without special dispensation, as literacy might give you dangerous ideas about your place in the divinely ordained social hierarchy. Justice for peasants was arbitrary and brutal. The lord of the manor typically served as judge in local disputes, creating an obvious conflict of interest when peasants had grievances against his agents or policies. Punishments were designed to be public and humiliating. Petty theft might be punished by public flogging or having an ear cut off. Poaching, hunting on the lord's lands could result in having your hands cut off or even execution, depending on what you killed and how merciful your particular lord felt that day. Women faced additional layers of subjugation. Not only did they answer to the local authorities, but they were legally subordinate to their fathers and then their husbands. Domestic violence was considered a man's right rather than a crime. Sexual violence was rarely prosecuted unless it involved a virgin of good standing or crossed class boundaries in ways that offended the elite. The most disturbing reality of peasant existence was how the system was designed to keep you trapped. Social mobility was almost non-existent. The child of a peasant would almost certainly die a peasant. Education wasn't just unavailable, it was actively discouraged for the lower classes. The church reinforced this rigid hierarchy by preaching that suffering in this life would be rewarded in heaven, and that questioning your station was sinful pride. Feudal obligations were hereditary. If your father owed service to a particular lord, so would you. If he died owing taxes or fees, those debts transferred to you. The entire system functioned to extract maximum labor while providing minimum sustenance, treating peasants essentially as human livestock to be worked, taxed, and controlled. Beyond the daily struggles, peasants lived with a level of physical suffering that modern medicine has largely eliminated from our experience. Dental care didn't exist for commoners. Toothaches, abscesses, and eventual tooth loss were simply facts of life. By age 30, most peasants had lost multiple teeth, making eating their already coarse diet even more difficult. Chronic pain from injuries and arthritis had no treatment beyond alcohol, herbal remedies of questionable efficacy, or in some cases, dangerous bloodletting that often made conditions worse. Hernias from heavy lifting, which are routinely repaired in simple procedures today, became life-threatening conditions that either killed you through strangulation or infection or left you permanently disabled if you survived. Childbirth was particularly horrific for peasant women. Without proper prenatal care, complications were common. Without clean environments or surgical options, obstructed labor often resulted in days of agony followed by death for both mother and child. Some medieval records suggest maternal mortality as high as 5 to 10% per birth, with women typically experiencing 5 to 7 pregnancies if they survived their childbearing years. Infant mortality was even more heartbreaking. In some medieval villages, 30% of children died before their first birthday, and 50% didn't reach adulthood. These weren't just statistics to medieval peasants. They were the routine grief of burying multiple children, often without being able to afford proper funerals. Disease was rampant and treatment was primitive at best. What we now know as simple infections regularly killed people. A cut from a farming implement could develop into sepsis within days. Common illnesses like influenza swept through villages annually, killing the very young and old. More serious epidemics, smallpox, typhoid, and of course bubonic plague, could wipe out entire communities. The Black Death of the 14th century killed an estimated 30–60% of Europe's population. While it affected all social classes, peasants were particularly vulnerable due to their malnutrition, crowded living conditions, and lack of ability to flee affected areas. In some villages, the mortality was so high that fields lay fallow for years afterward, with no one left to work them. Medical care, such as it existed, was largely unavailable to peasants. Physicians served the nobility and wealthy townspeople. Peasants relied on local wise women, village healers, or in some cases, the charity of monastic infirmaries. Many treatments were based on superstition or the theory of humors, often doing more harm than good. Let's have a quick reality check. While peasant life was undeniably harsh, not every aspect was unrelentingly grim. Peasant communities developed strong bonds of mutual support out of necessity. Village festivals provided rare moments of joy and celebration. The church calendar offered regular feasts that, while not eliminating hardship, punctuated the year with anticipated breaks from routine. Some regions and periods were better than others. A peasant in 13th century France during good harvest years might live reasonably well compared to a peasant in 14th century England during the aftermath of the Black Death. Customary rights varied widely, with some communities securing better terms from their lords through collective bargaining or even revolt. It's also worth noting that peasants weren't helpless victims without agency. They developed sophisticated strategies to resist exploitation, from intentionally working slowly on the lord's lands to hidden crop storage to organized revolts like the English Peasants' Rebellion of 1381 or the German Peasants' War of 1524–1525. While most of these rebellions were brutally suppressed, they sometimes resulted in modest improvements to conditions. Furthermore, toward the later medieval period, alternatives began to emerge. The growth of towns offered escape for some. Labor shortages after the Black Death gave surviving peasants more bargaining power, gradually leading to the commutation of labor services to rent payments and eventually the decline of serfdom itself in Western Europe. That said, the fundamental truth remains. Medieval peasant life was a brutal existence by any modern standard. The combination of exploitation, malnutrition, constant physical labor, endemic disease, and almost complete lack of agency created living conditions that the average modern person wouldn't survive for a month. So there you have it, the untold truth of the medieval peasant's brutal existence laid bare. The next time you complain about your boring job, tiny apartment, or the Wi-Fi being down, remember that your worst day in the 21st century would be an unimaginable luxury to a medieval peasant. Your smallest modern conveniences, clean water, abundant food, basic healthcare, limited work hours, would seem like impossible miracles to someone from the medieval countryside. While we often romanticize the past as a simpler, more authentic time, the gritty reality of peasant life was a daily horror show that most of us, raised in comfort and with expectations of basic human rights, would find unbearable. So perhaps, instead of yearning for a rustic pre-industrial existence, we should appreciate the remarkable progress that separates us from our medieval ancestors. After all, nothing makes modern inconveniences seem trivial, quite like the knowledge that at least you don't have to worry about your lord exercising his right to sleep with your bride on your wedding night, just one of the many indignities medieval peasants endured that your history teacher conveniently forgot to mention.